Good to see everybody. And hopefully this will be a very beneficial call to you. I had a good time last time we introduced the very first A2J special report, which dealt with the DISC profile and pastor leadership styles. And got a lot of excellent feedback from that conversation. Today, as Austin indicated, we're going to get into some church health metrics to either explain more fully to you or introduce you to. But I will mention, if I can get it on the screen, there you go. It's not very, oops, it's really not that blurry in real life. But anyway, little book that we did and released here just a couple months ago called Subject to Change, which is the subtitle, What People Want Their Pastor to Know Before Asking Them to Change. I've read a lot of change books. You have too. Decided to write this book from the perspective of those who are being changed, and just insights from about a decade or more of working with churches and just the really great people that had the opportunity to meet in congregations, kind of trying to dispel a little bit the idea of the demonic deacon, or those individuals that are always in our way, and rather realizing the partnership that's there. So it's a fun book. Hopefully it's beneficial. But anyway, that's what that was, and or that is rather. So, hey, as we jump in today, talking about metrics, when I was in the office full time several years ago, it's been right at a decade now. We started in 2012 with the study, figuring, in this business of church health, how do we measure that? What does that look like? And that led us to establish at least some initial metrics that could be drawn from the data that was available to us in the national office. But understanding what metrics are, Austin, if you can go ahead and share the screen there in that very first slide. You might be familiar with metrics from the world of baseball. Baseball management has radically changed over the last several years by use of the idea of metrics. And really what metrics are is an effort to really get underneath raw data and really begin to look at what we're doing with what we've got. In the world of the church, measuring nickels and noses as we have for so many years, that's valid data that helps us understand growth, but doesn't necessarily say a lot to health. And so while that kind of data really is focused on the resources we have gathered and our effectiveness in gathering those resources, people, finances, et cetera, metrics are more aimed at what are we doing with that? How are we producing? And one of the things I really like about metrics is it levels the field of measurement a little bit between the small and the large setting. So we're looking at efficiency. I launched into metric study back in 2012 with the dream of trying to identify the ideal size for the local church effectiveness. Which size church in the big picture is the most ideal. Maybe at the end we could talk about whether there were any legitimate conclusions to that particular goal or not. But in metrics, this is what we're asking is, what are we doing with what we've got? And so, as I said, started this a decade ago and have been reporting metrics annually to our executive leaders. A few times had the opportunity to share some of this reality with the general presbytery. There's a few settings in district events where I've had the opportunity to talk a little bit about this. And now as we travel and introduce the Acts 2 journey in new district settings, we make some use of some of this kind of information in helping understand the need. But by and large, metrics is not yet a widespread conversation in our fellowship. Last summer, is that right? Yeah, last summer, had the opportunity to share a detailed report with the general presbytery and got a chance to speak to them relative to that. And the response was the strongest that we've seen in the 10 years. I'm just excited that more and more folks are looking beyond our traditional standards of measurement to try to figure out how we're actually doing. And so in this document that you received, and I've got some slides to go along with this, what we've done is we've identified first of all, the 5 metrics that we've been working with for the last 10 years. These are metrics that are available to us. As I said, the data is available to us through the ACMR. I do reports every summer out of ACMR data provided to me by the national office. But we've also suggested other metrics that the local church would be the one that would have to measure, because we don't have access to the data that would be required. So let me just kind of explain these to you quickly, kind of stuff that we can learn from them, and then what we might do with those, and then certainly have a time to interact with questions or insights you might have. The first of these, the missional effectiveness ratio is what I call it. It's an AC ratio because it uses 2 measures. It uses attendance and conversions. And so by placing attendance over conversions, we're answering a question: how many of us did it take to lead somebody to Jesus this year? In our local church, what does that look like? So regardless of my attendance, how many of us did it take? So this one kind of came into focus for me in a real way a number of years ago. Got a call the week following Easter Sunday. I was talking to a pastor who's not too far from the Springfield, Missouri area, just down the road about 30 miles. And we were getting ready to meet to do some consulting with him. And I said, well, hey, how was Easter? And he said, well, we don't have near the stories to tell that. And he mentioned another area church that had already made it known of the couple hundred salvations they'd celebrated on Easter Sunday. He said, there's just 100 of us down here, and but hey, we did see. And he mentioned, I can't remember if it was 6 or 8 conversions on Easter Sunday, and I went, wow, yeah, that's an incredible day. Given 100 people leading 8 people to Jesus, I said, in truth, you had a more efficient, effective day than even the large church that was reporting its 100 saved. Well, that's what this metrics tells us, is how are we doing with what we've got? A great Bible story with metrics would be the parable of the talents, where, one guy's given 2 talents, another guy given 5, and they both double their effort, and they both get the same response from the master. They both are celebrated, even with the exact same statements in Jesus' story. Well done, you've been faithful with a few. That great acknowledgement of that. That's what this metric helps us do, is recognize the levels of effectiveness that are happening right here in our local church. So the math is easy. It's taking my average attendance over the year and dividing that by the number of people that were reported saved in that year. And that gives me this metric. And looking at, I have data now, or I've had data throughout this study since 1980. That's really when ACMR kind of hit its stride of providing us significant amounts of data. Going back now 40, whatever that is, 40, I should be getting the 21 data anytime now. We're past our 4th decade of data. And what we've observed is that growing churches that are stable, that are sustainable, are going to be reaching people at a metric here of about 5 to 1. Or in other words, church of 100 reporting conversions in a year of 20 or more is going to mean that church is being missionally effective in this particular health ratio. And so if you pop to the next one there, Austin, just to give you an idea of where we're at in our fellowship, and been tracking this and talking about it for a number of years now. Our smaller churches, I use the word smaller the smaller, larger line is 200. So churches under 200, which of course comprise a significant number of our churches. But churches under 200 actually don't see conversions at a rate that guarantees sustainability. This metric is a bit high for them. This last year, it averaged 7.4 to 1. Usually, before the COVID impact, it was about 6 or 6.5 to 1, where our larger churches, 200 plus, are seeing conversions at a significantly strong rate. Our largest churches, which would be churches 1,000 or more, it's amazing. They're seeing conversion rate at about 2.5 to 1, which basically says that 40% of their average attendance is getting saved in their church every year. And so, some of that can reflect in how we report. But the reality is that our larger churches do very well in this metric. They're reaching people. They're bringing people in. They're seeing people saved at a healthy rate, where our smaller churches are struggling. And I don't think that'll surprise anybody. Realizing that roughly half of the conversions reported in the Assemblies of God are reported by the largest 2% of our churches. So that, the truth is that the larger the church, typically the more effective they are in their efforts of evangelism, or at least in reporting of conversions. But that's just a metric that helps us. It's just a sample of how to apply it in the macro world of the Assemblies of God. But thinking about working with a local church, this is a great thing if you're sitting down with a congregation to look at. And I produce a report every year for each district on all their metrics that we're able to identify for their churches, as well as their region, how those compare with the nation. But in the local church, as a pastor, being able to track and to be aware of, what does this look like? Are we connecting effectively enough with the unsaved, in the unchurched? Are we seeing them come to Christ through the ministries of our church? And so 5 to 1 is a healthy measure within the Assemblies of God. I will mention that the Southern Baptist movement and Ed Stetzer's work on this, he targets in that environment 10 to 1, but they have a very different method of reporting. Their requirements of reporting are much more closer to how many folks are actually getting baptized in a year. And so the way the Assemblies of God reports, 5 to 1 is our target for health. Let me go more quickly through a couple of others here, a few others. The next one is what I call an assimilation ratio. It's conversions to water baptisms. This CW ratio, again, simple math, conversions on the top, water baptisms that year on the bottom, tells us basically, are we keeping our people, our conversions, those who've come to Christ, are we keeping them long enough in our church to get them into the water? Are we connecting those dots? And so, this is an assimilation metric because it talks about keeping people with us. Now, I've got some other connection metrics a little later in the report, but this one, frankly, if the people getting saved aren't staying with us, what does that say about other folks who are coming into our churches as new? Are they continuing with us? And so this is not the ultimate cover it all assimilation metric, but it gives us a snapshot, or at least a wedge of the picture of how we're doing with folks who have responded to our message. That hopefully that makes sense to you. And what we have identified there is that, given that we'll have some people come to Christ in outreach events, or maybe out of town guests, or folks who are not in a position to in an ongoing way connect with our church, we're going to recognize that even though we'd love it to be 1 to 1, it's obviously in the Assemblies of God, it's not, when we report 450,000 conversions every year, and essentially we report less than a third of that number in water baptism. So what's our target? Our target would be that this ratio not be any higher than 3 to 1. In other words, we are baptizing at least a third of those who report as conversions every year, in order to truly be healthy in this arena. And I could get into some of the extreme reporting that we see periodically. We try to weed some of that out because that affects our numbers, like the church in a town of 1,500 that might report 3,500 saved. Some of that kind of thing does happen in the ACMR. But in reality, 3 to 1 is a good effective ratio. And again, kind of looking at what this looks like across our nation, essentially churches under 200, they are healthy here. They typically, because they are going to be more easily relationally connected to people, their ability to keep people and get those saved to the step of water baptism is much greater much more effective than our larger churches. Our larger churches, on the whole, see less than a fourth of their conversions actually take that important step of water baptism. And again, as it gets higher, the bigger numbers, our larger churches, largest rather, churches of 1,000 or more, this is going to be closer to 1 out of 6 are actually being baptized. And so, there are implications here for our effectiveness in discipleship, as well, as how we doing with maintaining a connection with those who are responding to our message. A third metric combines these two. And, this is a question that helps us, are we truly growing the kingdom? You'll hear people every now and then make comments about the large church down the street, and they'll say, well, that's all just transfer growth or something like that. The church that's growing versus the one that's not. Well, that's all, and we'll come up with these things. Well, this metric helps us address that. What are we contributing in our local congregation to true kingdom growth? Recognizing that water baptism is typically a requirement for local church membership. How are we really adding to the church? Big picture, this metric helps us with this. And what's fascinating in the study is that this metric looks very similar regardless of church size. That our large churches and our small churches are generally fairly close to each other in this metric, meaning that large and small tend to be producing baptized converts at about the same rate in their year. And so there, of course, is a difference in the rate between growing and declining churches. But as far as church size, it's not necessarily a huge factor. There's some variation, but not a great deal. There are other metrics to measure. I'm looking here at my next slide, Austin, and I think I got the wrong one next. Forgive me. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. No, let's pop to the next one. Yeah. So let's talk about discipleship and motivation, or mobilization rather. This is a question that says, are we getting people spirit baptized? Are our converts, are we leading them to spirit baptism? And there is certainly just cause for concern in this area over the last few decades, as we've been struggling to see spirit baptisms grow as our rate of conversions has over the last 20, 30 years. So, what does this look like? We call this a discipleship and a mobilization metric because, number one, it helps us measure, are we discipling people to this empowering encounter with Christ, with the Holy Spirit? Are we getting them there? That's a discipleship metric. But then also this metric helps us measure, are we mobilizing the ones that are being spirit baptized? Because you understand that as our number of spirit baptisms grows, our number of conversions should too, because the fundamental priority, purpose, reason for being of spirit baptism is empowering us for mission, empowering us to fulfill Christ's purpose. So if the number of spirit baptized people is growing, our number of conversions should be growing alongside. Certainly, that should be happening. We have some churches, as you have probably experienced, where they really emphasize spirit baptism, but unfortunately that experience is largely personalized, and we have, everybody in our church speaks in tongues, but we're not reaching anybody. So that's a mobilization problem if that's what's occurring. So this metric gives us some insight into both of those. That kind of makes it a little bit tricky to fully to comprehend easily. It's one of our more challenging metrics. The math, again, is easy. Conversions over spirit baptisms. And what we want to see here, and our goal here for health would be that this ratio actually be between 3-to-1 and 4-to-1, because we're measuring the two things. If it's higher than 4-to-1, that means we're not getting people to spirit baptism. But if it gets lower than 3-to-1, that means we're not mobilizing our spirit baptized people to reaching new friends. And so that's why there's this middle ground. And depending on which side of that we're on, um, that tells us where our challenge is. I can tell you that here's some data, or as far as national result, is that we only are actually seeing people spirit baptized at about 1/6 of our converts. It's at 6 to 1. So that indicates that we're not getting our converts to spirit baptism. In fact, we're not getting our converts to spirit baptism at all like we used to. Back in the 1980s and 90s, this ran about 4 to 1, not 6 to 1. And so we're seeing fewer and fewer of our converts and fewer of our people come to spirit baptism. And this metric identifies that particular problem. Again, our smaller churches actually do quite a bit better here. Our smaller churches actually, as a whole, have a healthy rate of leading people to spirit baptism. They tend to be right there in that range that we target, an average of about 3.5 to 1. So that's interesting. Again, relationship, often in the smaller church, the ability to engage people in settings where spirit baptism might occur can oftentimes be a little more significant. The larger setting often struggles to provide those environments. In churches over 100, 6.5 to 1. What does that mean? Well, what that means is for every 7 people being saved in a church of 200 or more, only one of them is ever going to come to spirit baptism. And that's actually 8 to 1 in our largest churches. So while the larger churches report a great number of converts, getting them to spirit baptism is something that is not happening at a healthy rate. And so our question there is, how can we continue to be a spirit empowered church if the people we're leading to Christ and discipling are not becoming spirit baptized? And then let me do one more, and then I'll take a breath and pause and see questions about these, because these are the ones that we are able to measure because we have availability of ACMR data. This fifth one, again, kind of combines these last two, asking the question, are we producing spirit-empowered leaders? Think about it. To be a pastor in our fellowship, spirit baptism is an absolute essential. To be ordained, credentialed, a missionary, to serve as a deacon in the majority of our churches. We're talking about this necessity of spirit baptized people in order to lead our fellowship. And so as we think about our future, are we reproducing spirit baptized disciples in order to provide for the spiritual leadership of our congregations? Are we doing that at a healthy rate? And so we've targeted here a ratio of between 15 and 20 to 1. I won't get into the lengthy explanation of why that's the number. I'd be glad to visit with you individually about that if that's your desire. But this is where the healthy range would be. And again, what we're seeing is that the majority of our churches are beyond this. They're well above 20 to 1 because we're not getting people to spirit baptism. And so that certainly makes it difficult for us to be producing future leaders for our churches at a healthy rate. So every year we do a special report on our Acts 2 Journey churches. We look at every church that's gone through the journey in its now 12 years of existence, and we monitor that, and we're able to see, journey wide, how are our churches doing, where are the improvements, and we're able to verify the improvements. The first several years, what we've seen is that about in the first couple years after a church completes the journey, their discipleship and their assimilation metrics improve and improve significantly. What we were waiting to see is the evangelism metric and wanting to see the missional effectiveness metric and that improve. And this last year, we now have enough data together with our churches to see that by about the third year after a church has engaged the Acts 2 journey, they've begun to initiate their plan. Now we're seeing some significant improvement in their outward focus, in their missional effectiveness metrics as well. So we're able to track, what impact have we had? without just saying, has the attendance grown? Well, the attendance does grow, but where are they getting better? And it seems right out of the gate, they get better in assimilation and discipleship. But then closely now on the heels of that is a growth in their evangelism and their efforts, which, as we said from the beginning of the journey, evangelism is the area that nearly every one of our churches struggles with the most as we encounter them. And we're now seeing that improvement once they begin to get their plans fully immersed into the life of their congregation. I have had people at different times, oh, it's just numbers, it's just numbers. No, well, I'm a person that says all the time, Kingdom of God's not about numbers, it's about stories, but numbers tell a story. And our numbers do tell the story of what's really happening. And, the other thing I'd mention about health, and this, I put this in the document. If you're going to measure health, that's multiple measures to do that. You go to the doctor. I went for my annual checkup last week. Go to the doctor, and the doctor's going to measure multiple things to try to determine if you're healthy. And some of those things might be good news. Some of those things might not be. And so what the doctor wants you to target, or came back and wants me to target, are a couple of measures that weren't so good, so that I can be healthy. So it's church health is going to operate the very same way, in that there's not a single measure that is the end all in this regard, but instead it's multiple measures that speak to a variety of things. And some of those are good news, and some of those may need medication. They need a prescription in order to see some turnaround. And so that's another way or a primary way that this kind of information can get used. Well, there are a few other metrics that I have suggested in this document that I don't have the ability to measure nationally because we don't gather this data. But helping churches know, and these are simple, and these are, I hope, would be helpful. I'd love for even more conversation about other metrics that could help us. But I'm introducing 5 other, and these are, again, no surprise. A lot of them are not new in the sense of these are things that we think about, but measuring beyond just what ACMR says. So, question, are we helping people enlarge Christ's mission through serving? Now, for the last 6 or 7 years, we had added a volunteer question to the ACMR. Unfortunately, I learned just a week or so ago that one was removed this year from the ACMR, which pains me deeply. And I'm going to do all I can to lobby to see it returned, because it was just getting data that was really starting to help us. But this has helped, how are we doing? Are people involved in our churches? Are they getting involved? That just about every survey of pastors' greatest frustration, this one's at the top, is getting people involved in ministry is number one on nearly every list of pastors' most significant frustrations in ministry. And so I think this one's worth measuring in a significant way. And what we discovered, fascinating as it is that regardless of size of church in the Assemblies of God, we essentially have about 30% of our people are involved. We identify 30% of our people as involved in ministry. Church of 50, church of 5,000. 30% is often roughly about where, 30% is right at where we are. So, we've sometimes said, 1 in 4 are involved in ministry. It's a tiny bit better than that. But it's 30% of our people are engaged in ministry. Now, there is a difference between growing churches and declining churches. Declining churches, believe it or not, have a higher percentage of their people involved in ministry than growing churches. So that means one of two things. Either we're struggling in growing churches to get people involved in ministry at the rate that we're able to reach them, or in many of our declining churches, we have people involved in ministries that are not really producing for the kingdom. We're doing what we've always done, but we're not necessarily aiming our ministries outside our walls. We might be serving ourselves more than we are serving our broader communities. And so there's some implications for this. This is one of my favorite metrics to study right now because, like I said, the data is relatively new, 7 years of data that we had before this interruption this year. And so, but this is, again, how are we doing with this? This is something good for a pastor, um, something good for a pastor to be able to know in that regard. Another one, thank you for that one, Austin. Yeah, 30%. How are we doing in getting people involved in discipleship? What's our small group discipleship metric, and what does that look like? So again, the math's not hard. Total attendance over small group attendance. But this one's kind of interesting in our measurement to us because most of us remember the days of Sunday school, and Sunday school being the dominant discipleship program for the Assemblies of God. Some of us are old enough to remember when in many churches, Sunday school attendance was actually a little higher than worship attendance. That was pre-1970s, but that actually did occur in many churches. But even as late as the early 1990s, Sunday school attendance tracked at about 85% roughly of worship attendance. Well, we know when small group approach began to replace Sunday school as our typical or our prominent discipleship arm, 85% is not, I mean, it's just not a thing. The reality is that 35, 40%, 50%, 50% would have been a really strong response to small group participation. So, how do we measure that today? Our real target for discipleship would be that 60% of our people be engaged. That should be a target for healthy. This is from a lot of different literature. Setting that target, that would be the goal. That 60% of our worship attenders be involved in a small group. Now, certainly, we'd love to have 100%, but are we getting people involved at a healthy rate? 60% would be that particular threshold that we would target. And so if we're less than that, then obviously we have something to work on there. We've got to, figure out, how can we get more and more people involved in our small groups? And of course, thinking about the different reasons we have small groups, because some of our small groups are not discipleship focused. So we might have people in a small group in order to connect as a primary goal, which is a legitimate goal. But just because folks are in small groups doesn't necessarily mean significant discipleship might be happening, but at least we're building connection that would make those kind of goals possible. And so 60% would be a good metric there. Another one, how are we doing with connecting with new people in our church? This would be the next slide there, Austin. Are we connecting? What's happening when somebody visits our church? Are they coming back? And these metrics kind of come from, these are historical. They've been around for quite a while. But what we do know or have always understood is that if we're doing a good job of hospitality, 50% of our local guests, or people who could come back, actually will come again. So that's illustrated, I think, on the next slide. What we're calling a guest retention. Whoops. I'm sorry, guest return. That's right. Guest return metric. This is 50%. So obviously you got to be keeping track of this to know, but if 50% of our people are coming back a second time, that means that they generally had a positive experience, one that caused them to want to come again on that first visit. So this is more of a hospitality metric, not really an assimilation metric, but it's, how did we do? Did we extend a healthy welcome? We know the number one thing people are looking for when they visit a church is they're looking for friends. So on that first Sunday, did they at least discover the potential for that, such that they would come back again? Did they feel like, hey, I could find friends here? Well, if 50% of our local guests return, then we identify that that's a healthy rate and does not indicate that we have some sort of hospitality problem or disconnect with those goals. If it's less than 50%, I work with a lot of churches, maybe you do too, where they say, hey, we have people visit, but nobody comes back. Well, probably they're not actually measuring that. But when they do, if it is less than 50%, then they need to look at that whole guest experience. What's that look like? What's it like for somebody to visit our church? Are we truly as friendly as we think we are? And those kind of things. Another metric using some of the similar one, kind of a stage 2, is guest retention. And this is more of an assimilation, asking the question, are they still with us a year later? And what we do know there's a lot of data available out there, Sticky Church, all these different places that have this data, that a church that's going to be a growing, healthy church typically sees about 20% of their first-time guests ultimately assimilate into the congregation. 20% would indicate a growing congregation. A lot of reports will tell us 10% need to be assimilated just to keep up with the death and transfer rate in most local churches, just to sustain the church. But 20% is often what we're going to see in churches that are truly healthy, or something approaching 20%. So again, these are things pastor can monitor. And this one is more of an assimilation metric, because we are talking about being able to keep people among us and a part of our congregation a full year later. And then the last one in this particular report is a brand new one that I've been wondering about for a while, and just did some initial work. An idea here is, what about people called to full-time ministry? What's happening here? The reason this strikes home for me is I grew up in a church that has been plateaued pretty much for, goodness, the years are going by here, but I think I could say this congregation has been at a plateaued attendance level for about 50 years. However, in a community that has grown from 50,000 to 500,000. And so we look at that and we say, oh, what's wrong? What's going on here? Another church down the street, another Assemblies of God church, grew from 0 to 3,000 over that same time period. So here's a church that has been plateaued at about 300. That's kind of, Kent Duncan's jumped in there. Kent knows the church I'm talking about. We're both from the same area. But this is my home church, his wife's home church as well. But that home church over those 50 years saw over 100 people go out of that church into full-time vocational ministry. So even though the attendance never grew, over 100 people are in full-time ministry today out of the ministries of that church. So where does that fit into this? And that launched me into asking this particular question, and this is a suggested metric, something to look at. Are we producing missionaries, evangelists, pastors, denominational leaders, youth pastors, the full gamut of vocational ministers, and what should that look like? And my suggestion in this metric, again, this has not been studied fully yet, but just kind of a last one to toss in to think about, is that if we look at my local church over the last 10 years, how many folks have gone out in vocational ministry? For us to be healthy, that number should at least be how many vocational ministers we're using in our church. In other words, if our congregation is using or has 4 vocational staff members in our church, we should at least have produced 4 vocational staff members for the kingdom at large. Otherwise, we are using more ministry resources than we're producing, and that wouldn't be viewed as healthy. So again, just something to think about, to look at there. So certainly welcome input into all of these kind of things. But that last one is something, like I said, just launching into that study. I don't have the access again to, I know the church I pastored, and the church I pastored in Kansas and Wichita, when I got there, discovered that the last missionary that had gone out from that church had gone out 50 years prior. And so immediately realizing, oh, wait a minute, this was a historic Assembly of God church that had not produced a vocational missionary in 50 years. And so we began to see something change there, and gladly something did. So again, just metrics. What are we doing with what we've got? That's really what this is about. What are we doing with what we've got? And again, in so many of these metrics, I told you at the beginning, I started out thinking, what if we could identify the ideal size of a church for being most effective, most healthy? The end result is that metric by metric, I can probably tell you based on size, which sizes of churches do the best. But collectively, our largest churches do well with some of these and struggle mightily with others. Our smaller churches do well with some of these and struggle mightily with others. I can't come to a conclusion and say this particular size church is the ideal in American Christianity. That did not result, or at least I can't fairly say that. I can say that There are enormous inefficiencies in some of our largest places when it comes to looking at what are we doing with what we've got. And there are also enormous inadequacies in some of our smaller places when we talk about what are we doing with what we've got. So the goal would be whoever we are, wherever we're at, we need to get healthy, and we want to be healthier next year than we are at this time this year.